Hello again. A few decades ago, conservationist Sir Peter Scott set up the Wildfowl Trust, which later became known as the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. It consisted of 10 nature reserves, 7 of which also included a living collection of captive wildfowl from around the world. So if you like, 7 of the sites were a zoo, a wildfowl collection that is, and a nature reserve as well. 3 of the sites are standalone nature reserves. My next guest is Mr. David Pickett. He is Centre and Reserve Manager at one of those Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust reserves, Caerlaverock. He talks about the difference between a single species and whole ecosystem approach to conservation. Instead of a single species approach, can whole ecosystem conservation help offset the biodiversity crisis? Okay. David Pickett, welcome to the Practical Animal Channel.
Hello.
David, what jobs are there, first of all, working with specifically wildfowl? I mean, I guess your job, you are and reserve manager at Caerlaverock Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust. Is that 2 jobs in one?
It is, yes. I mean, I'm, called the Centre and Reserve Manager. So my job manages the 1,500-acre nature reserve, but also the visitor centre as well. But I tend to shorten it and just call myself the site manager, and it's a lot more straightforward that way.
Is there a collection at Caerlaverock as well?
No, there isn't. No.
So how does Caerlaverock, what's its goal? How does it relate to the other nature reserves nationwide, which are part of the Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust?
Well, the WWT have got 10 sites across the country. Of those, 7 of them are a mixture of nature reserve and what they call the living collection. But 3 of the sites don't have living collections. So of those 3 sites, 2 have visitor centre and nature reserve. So that's WWT Caerlaverock and WWT Welney. And then Sturt Marshes just is a nature reserve on its own. So we have a range of sites, and not all of them have living collections by any means.
What are the species that are noteworthy that made Caerlaverock be declared a nature reserve?
Well, to start off with, when it first became a nature reserve back in 1971, I guess the main interest were the barnacle geese. The Solway is the only place where the Svalbard population of barnacle geese actually overwinter. So the whole of the population of barnacle geese on Svalbard all come down to the Solway for the winter. there are 3 different populations of barnacle geese in the world, but though they look very similar, they all keep geographically very separate. So originally, after the Second World War, there was only about 400 of the Svalbard barnacle geese left. But through a huge conservation effort, a real partnership effort between a number of different organizations, including WWT, that population started to rise. And WWT set up their reserve here in 1971 to offer sort of safe feeding and to manage a sanctuary area of salt marsh for the barnacle geese. And that was probably the first species that was of interest. But gradually over time, it's been realized that actually it's a real biodiversity hotspot. And we're moving more and more towards managing the wetland habitat and restoring wetland habitats rather than managing for single species. And in that way, actually, manage for a much wider and greater biodiversity.
Is the barnacle goose the rarest species on the reserve?
No. I mean, we don't know all of the species on the reserve because that's the way these things work, but probably our rarest species is Triops, which is the tadpole shrimp, which is a primitive and rare sort of invertebrate that's only found in 2 places in the UK. One, a small site down in the New Forest, and the other place is Caerlaverock. So that's definitely probably the rarest species here.
Wow. So of the barnacle geese, you said there are 3 populations. Is each population a subspecies? So there are 3 subspecies?
I don't think they're actually subspecies, and certainly they're very similar physically. But it's through ringing studies they found that they just don't intermix.
So assuming that, if we say for the sake of argument, the 3 populations are 1 species and 1 subspecies, does Caerlaverock get a third of the world population over the winter?
Probably not. I don't know the size of the other populations, but not all of the barnacle geese that winter on the Solway now spend that winter on Caerlaverock. The population has now grown from those 400 individuals after in the 1940s, after the Second World War, to at the beginning of last winter, 40,000 individuals. So they winter on the north and south side of the Solway, either side of it. Of course, that population number has changed because of bird flu badly impacted the population. And now the first estimate of the number of wintering barnacle geese that have come back this winter is about 30,000. So that population has dropped by about 25% just over one winter.
Excuse me. How does bird flu affect your job, David?
Well, it's a serious consideration. I mean, part of the job is to monitor the impact that bird flu has on the wildlife on the site. So WWT Caerlaverock is part of a UK-wide contract that WWT has with DEFRA to monitor, or it's like a surveillance for bird flu. So any dead birds that we find, we swab and send those off to be tested. So that's part of the job. Last winter, once we identified that we had bird flu on the site, rather than swabbing every bird we found, our job then became to monitor the progress of mortality. So what was the rate of disease on the site? So there's all of that, but then as part of the job also, we have to be very careful that we're not spreading bird flu onto other sites or onto other species. So both as we go about our work, we have to make sure we're very biosecure, so disinfecting boots and wearing all the right PPE. And we also have to set up biosecurity for visitors coming to the site as well.
David, in order for somebody watching this to better understand the role of being a site manager of a nature reserve, can your job be divided up into annual, seasonal, and monthly tasks?
Very much so. I mean, very broadly speaking, we do a lot of our practical work in the winter, and then a lot of survey and monitoring work in the summer. There are peaks and troughs for visitor interaction as well. So yes, I mean, there's definitely a seasonality about the work, but it isn't all just being out there communing with nature.
The aim of these discussions is to provide insight for people who are students of animal management, people who want a career change, and who want to work with animals and want to know what it takes. So, what skills does a site manager need to manage a nature reserve?
Well, I think, I mean, the thing to understand is that we're managing nature reserves, so we're not necessarily working with animals. So it's an ecological skill that you need, and it's that ecological view. But there's a number of skills that you need. I mean, a site manager has to be basically a jack of all trades. You have to have a lot of practical knowledge for delivering site tasks, maintenance and management of habitats. You need to be really well organized and to be planning ahead constantly. And you need a lot of people skills. So you're not, as I say, you're not off in the wilds, just, looking at nature the whole time. Actually, the large amount of your job is dealing with researchers, dealing with contractors, managing a team of staff, working with volunteers, and probably most of all, working with the public. So it's really key, if you want to go into site management, to understand the purpose of the job and the purpose of the sites. So these sites are, they're not just to manage biodiversity. That is a key part of it. But in these days, we don't just manage biodiversity up to the boundary of the site and that's it. We look at the way the sites work within the whole landscape. So working in partnership with others, whether it's neighboring landowners, other conservation organizations, community groups. And then you have to understand what the reserves mean to the organization. So part of our purpose is to showcase wildlife that draws visitors in, because that economic benefit of the reserve then goes to support conservation work elsewhere. But we also have to relate to our members. So those are people who have got an annual membership and are contributing to our conservation work already. So we have that sort of audience we have to support as well. So and then also the reserve has to act as an example of best practice management, and an example that inspires people to go away and actually make a difference themselves. So that sort of education side as well. So all of those are really key aspects of the job. and it's you need to have that basic understanding before you can really develop the job and take the site management forward.
What sort of personal qualities does a person need, David? I mean, apart from people's skills, patience, what else? I'm guessing you don't need manual dexterity like you would with birds of prey and falconry because you employ contractors. But what other personal qualities can you give us an idea of?
Well, there's that range of skills. I mean, you have to be very adaptable. You have to be very good at problem solving. You have to have a dogged determination to deal with constant, sort of issues and problems that are put up in front of you. So you have to be prepared to work in all weathers and be uncomfortable, wet through to the skin. And I suppose one of the things that people ask, well, what's the point in working in conservation? Because with climate change and the biodiversity crisis, everything's going downhill anyway. But so you have to have a positive outlook as well and remain positive, because if you're a pessimist, then and you think it's all going downhill, then you won't last long in the job.
Do you need a degree to do the job?
There are people who are managing sites. You've got a certain level of skills and a certain level of application, and it helps in having those underlying ecological knowledge, which means that you're able to apply what you know to coming up with the management prescriptions needed.
David, could you describe how your own career developed, please?
Well, I guess I always wanted to work on a bird reserve right from an early age. And so I did a degree in zoology, and then basically started to piece together practical experience. To start off with, a lot of that practical experience was more working as a countryside ranger, which is similar work, but with different emphases. But gradually I was able to move sideways and start managing nature reserves. So I did some work abroad as well, sort of. So it was a matter of stitching together lots and lots of bits of experience of different habitats and different organizations, so it's gradually built up like that. I've worked for NGOs, and then also worked for Nature Scott, so for the government as well, and now back working for a wildlife charity. So it's good to have a view of different organizations and how they operate and what their objectives are.
As a site manager and conservationist, David, what meetings or people or books have most influenced your thinking?
Yeah, that's a hard one to answer. I can remember reading a book when I was still at university, and I'm trying to remember the guy's name. Was it Rhys Green, who was at University of Kent? But anyway, the thing that inspired me there was that he was looking at management at the RSPB reserve at Dungeness, where they've got a very large shingle peninsula. And what interested me was they previously, all the management there they'd had to bring in funding to do the management, and then through working with the gravel extraction companies, they were able to get pools dug to the best specification for wildlife, but that also generated money and income. And so that was a really good example of how nature conservation can sort of pay for itself, and so how management of nature reserves can have a sort of a sustainable way of actually funding. So you don't always have to put your hand out and sort of ask for charity, basically.
David, what do you look for in volunteers?
Volunteers, they have to be keen. They have to be they don't have to show any track record for working in the past, you know, on conservation, but where they just have to be prepared to turn their hand to just about everything and fit in with the team that we've got. So we have volunteers of all ages, all shapes and sizes, and they come in 1 day a week, and we would struggle to manage the reserve without them.
Is there any books that you can recommend to people who want to get involved in the work of Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust? I mean, I did college work experience over 30 years ago at Slimbridge, and I'm using that, I suppose, as my reference point.
Right.
Didn't WWT publish a scientific journal periodically, Wildfowl, or?
They did. I'm not sure whether they still do or not anymore, but so yeah, I'm not sure about that. Yes, I mean, there's a lot of books out there which you could read. I mean, the one by Isabella Tree, is it Wilding, about Knepp Estate? That's as that's, you know, worth looking at just in terms of a new way of thinking of land management and particularly of nature reserves. I'm struggling to come up with something off the top of my head for of anything else to suggest, I'm afraid.
No problem. Is the job more about? I'm getting the impression that the job isn't just about maintaining and enhancing populations of barnacle geese, but rather optimizing the biodiversity of the site itself. Is that right?
Oh yes, that's what a nature reserve is. So I think any nature reserve is not about single species management, and that can be a dangerous route to go down, as you find with barnacle geese that you can be managing the reserve to the very best of your ability, but something like bird flu comes along and absolutely knocks out a big chunk of the population. The same as if you're managing a nature reserve for seabirds, and it might be a seabird breeding site, but and you just manage it for that. But if the seas around the island are in a poor state, then all you're doing is managing a site that's a safe place for the seabirds to starve. So the nature reserve is all about managing a biodiversity hotspot within a landscape. And it's a dangerous thing to start thinking about just a boundary around it and just start thinking about a single species. Yeah, it's very much about managing habitats.
For somebody who wants to work as a site manager in the future, can you offer any careers advice or perhaps a career plan?
Yeah, I mean, I would suggest, unfortunately, it often has to start with some volunteering. So if you can get some volunteering in some form or other, then that's a good start. If you can do that either before you go to university or while you're at university, even better. The thing to look out for is there's a number of these year-long sort of either placements or apprenticeships these days that can be a real good first step on the ladder. So you can either do it as part of a sandwich year course or when you come out of university. Some of them are 12-month volunteering positions. Some of them are paid a low wage. But anything like that, or residential volunteering for the RSPB, anything like that gives you a really solid chunk of practical experience, is a good thing, really. And you might have to stitch one or two of those things together before somebody, actually takes you on for a paid role. But then it's a matter of getting in at the bottom as a warden's position or assistant warden, something like that. Or there's a lot of seasonal positions where you're working on nature reserves just for the summer months. But and then gradually you can get bits and pieces of experience like that to that fills out your CV in effect, and is enough to tempt an employer to give you a full-time job. I mean, another way of doing it, or an additional way of doing it, is there's some fantastic opportunities abroad as well. So going abroad to do volunteering placements or seasonal jobs can really, make your CV look good, but also gives you a really different outlook, enables you to talk well at interviews. So that's something that I did as well.
David, what is your view of managing sites for conservation, biodiversity hotspots within a landscape today?
What do you mean? What's my view?
In terms of how complex is it? Is it something that, if you compare it today with 10 years from now, are you satisfied with the way that conservation is going? What would you change if you could? How far in advance do you have to plan?
Well, I would say looking at biodiversity as a whole, then I would say things are not going very well. We're in a biodiversity crisis, and we're seeing common species declining for all sorts of reasons, whether it's due to intensification of farming or climate change, problems across the world. So with nature reserves, we can't actually solve that problem just with nature reserves. That's why we have to look on a wider scale across landscapes. There is a lot of very good partnership work going ahead now that never used to happen. So there's, I think more and more people are looking across a landscape role. But one of the issues that you have when you're managing nature reserves now is it's very difficult to get the core funding. So to get funding on a year-by-year basis that just is ongoing is very tricky. So often you can get funding on a project basis, but for the core funding, it's much more difficult. And it used to be that you might be able to get project funding for 3 or 4 years in advance, but now the way government budgets and grant funding bodies are going, sometimes it's down to only 12 months at a time. So it's actually a very inefficient way of working when you're having to spend a chunk of your time constantly looking for new money to actually move to the next step on the reserve. So there's pros and cons. I mean, to counter that, there are some good funding opportunities that are looking at landscape improvements, particularly relating to, I suppose, making places climate change ready, so making them more resilient. So that seems to be where the emphasis is. But I say it can be hard work. There's a lot of competition trying to get that sort of funding. In terms of talking to the general public, I mean, there is increasing awareness amongst the public about some of the issues. So that's quite good to see, but we've still got a long way to go in getting the public on board, and that's part of what nature reserves are. We want to inspire and send people away so that they go away and do their bit, but we've got a huge amount of work for people to actually start to change their lifestyles, start to do a bit that actually helps to mitigate climate change and offset the biodiversity crisis. So it's something that we keep working away at. And one of the things that inspires sort of our team at Caerlaverock is something that we think we've got an opportunity to actually make a difference. We can actually, where the visitors that come in, we can send them away just starting to think about their impact that their lifestyles have and how they might be able to change that, what they might be able to do in their garden, how they might be able to volunteer, what organizations they might be able to financially support. So, that's something that we're working on hard and keen to sort of try and make that difference.
Just a few minutes left, but have you ever met Sir Peter? Did you ever meet Sir Peter Scott, David?
No, I've only worked for WWT for a year. So he died quite a long time ago. So unfortunately, I never got to meet him.
David, this is, I'm going to try and throw this in, but it's potentially a massive question. What is driving this biodiversity crisis? Is it global habitat loss, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I think, it's climate change, global habitat loss, which is coming about through increased population and the capitalist drive in society for growth. People are getting richer and richer. All of that will be impacting biodiversity. It's a very wide-ranging issue.
David, is there anything that you'd like to add?
No, I think we've probably covered more than enough ground already, so nothing else to add, I'm afraid.
David Pickett, Site and Reserve Manager at Caerlaverock Wildfowl and Wetlands Trust, thank you very much for being on the Practical Animal Channel.
Right, well, thank you.